Hi, my name is Jay Sugarman, and I want to welcome you to Museum Open House. This ongoing series features and highlights many of the outstanding museums and other cultural institutions. The main purpose of most programs is to inform viewers about current and upcoming exhibits, various programs, resources, and other opportunities that are available for the general public. Today, via Zoom, we're fortunate to have as our guest Sebastian Belfanti. Sebastian serves as the executive director of the West End Museum, a neighborhood museum dedicated to the collection, preservation, and interpretation of the history and culture of the West End of Boston. During the program, we'll learn about the history and mission of the museum, as well as find out about the recent renovation or reopening due to a devastating flood that kept the museum closed for more than 2 years. We'll go on a behind the scenes tour and in the process come to better understand and appreciate the new exhibit, programs, events, and other opportunities that are available for visitors today. Let's start by meeting Sebastian and then finding out all about the West End Museum. Welcome, Sebastian. So delighted you're able to be here.
So much for having me.
Before we hear all about the museum, I think it would be of interest to hear just a little bit about your background, and then what attracted you to the museum, and then we'll jump right into hearing about the very pleasing reopening.
Sure. So my background's a little atypical for this, although that's in itself is kind of common. So I was a geologist or an igneous petrologist, um, and I was working on my PhD at Vanderbilt uh, through 2019, and then decided that that just wasn't what I wanted to do with the rest of my career, and left with a master's degree and no like clear plan of what was going to happen next. Um, so I moved up to Boston because I'd always wanted to live here. My mom grew up here, and my dad's family had a house on the Cape, so we'd been around
Mm.
a lot. And the Red Sox were basically the family religion growing up. So so I came up here and I just started doing some volunteer work. I did an internship where I just whatever, trying to figure stuff out, and ended up volunteering at the Weston Museum as a program director when we were still all volunteer. And then in so that was in 2019, and then in 2020, I was hired as the museum's first paid staff uh, on February. So we were open normally for a month before COVID, right?
Mm.
And then kind of I took it through COVID, was able to grow the budget by like 6x during COVID, and then
Mm.
um, in 2022, two, um, we started. Obviously, we had the flood in January, but we were also able to both hire me as a like full-time employee as opposed to on contract, and bring on an archivist and curator. And now we're up to 4 staff.
Fabulous, fabulous. Before we hear more about the museum current renovation, for those not familiar with the area, could you give us a little sense of the context of the city we're talking about? And then very briefly, a little of the long and rich history.
There. So the West End, as the museum, focuses on the historic extent of the West End, which is different than the modern. So today, the West End extends from North Washington Street to Cambridge Street, ending at Sudbury, so on the edge of Government Center, or really in the middle of Government Center, but on the edge of what people think of as Government Center. Um, Historically, it followed that line and went all the way up to Pinckney Street, so actually cuts um, the State House in half, and follows that line all the way to the water. So about half or 2/3 of the streets on Beacon Hill were part of the West End until 1960. So the museum covers that area as well, but the modern West End doesn't include it.
Well, one topic just to hear a little bit more of is the very controversial urban renewal project from 50s and 60s. Just a few words about this, because I know that plays a prominent role in the museum.
Absolutely, yeah. So the museum was founded by people who were forcibly removed from the West End between primarily 1958 to 1962, but into the 70s as well. Um, who so basically in 1953, Boston announced that it was gonna tear down the West End. It had already at this point done one very small urban renewal project in the South End, and the West End was chosen because it was kind of very visible and would make
Mm.
kind of be a big impact. Ironically, that ended up kind of being one of its flaws politically because it was such a disaster in the end that like the Government Center garage and stuff was built basically to try to hide it.
Mm.
But at the time that was seen as a positive. And the North End, which was better qualified for clearance, was on the other side of the central artery. So wasn't seen as a visible enough thing to kind of go after. Um, so yeah, so 1953, the project was announced. The city encouraged people to stop maintaining their properties. A couple of years later, uh, the the city actually rezones parts of the West End. Um, on the map I showed previously, this will be the kind of dark black sort of upside down L in the
Mm.
middle. The what is now called Charles Ver Park, but originally made up most of the upper end, and um, and that area, it became illegal to have apartments that opened onto an alleyway, which obviously is very common in many Boston neighborhoods still today. And so that plus the lack of maintenance started to like encourage people to leave between 1953 and 1958. The neighborhood lost about half of its population,
Mm.
so it fell from 12,500 to 7,000. Um, and then in 1958, uh, after garbage collection and things were stopped to make the neighborhood actually qualify, um, it this urban renewal project or slum clearance, it was still called at the time, uh, was uh, was approved by the federal government. There was some pushback from the community. The city ended up acknowledging that they had kind of broken the rules in getting it qualified, but like too bad paperwork stuff. So they they move forward with this. Ultimately, in this first project that we're looking at, about 40 to 50 acres
Mm.
of the neighborhood is removed. Ultimately, about 100 acres, about 35 streets, and more than 400 buildings were demolished in the West End.
Very
Yeah,
devastating indeed. Well, moving on to the museum, a little bit about how it first came about, and then again, jumping ahead to what went into the redesign, the recreation that we can all enjoy now.
sure. So this month is actually our 20th anniversary. So the museum was founded in 2004. Original kind of exploration of a West End museum by people displaced from the West End started in the late 1980s.
Mm.
But there was, I mean, there were lack of resources, and very critically, there wasn't a space available. So in the early 90s, a group of displaced West Enders who were advocating for affordable housing and for housing for displaced West Enders in the old West End, um, were able to sue and seize the final undeveloped property from Charles River Park Associates. Um, and so in that process, they were involved, and there's a lot of lawsuits and stuff in here that I'm gonna skip for this. But eventually, that building was built with a lot of the, not without a lot of the things that they had hoped for, but with this space for a museum or visitor center, and they chose to found a museum. So here we are. Um, the museum opened with as like really almost nothing. It was like plywood boards with
Mm.
stuff tacked to them. And then after 3 years, it was we got our previous permanent exhibit, which I know you saw before the flood. Um, the last tenement, which had been originally installed in the old State House by the Bostonian Society now, which is now part of Revolutionary Spaces.
Mm.
And so they'd done this, what at the time was a really like groundbreaking exhibit on this, on urban renewal and on this working class community in Boston. It was very uncommon to cover that kind of history still at that time. Um, and that got reinstalled or kind of adjusted and reinstalled, and it sort of mostly worked ish. It definitely had some like major flaws, and one of which was that it never actually explained what urban renewal was. That was definitely the most obvious one. And so, but that functioned reasonably well for us from 2007 to 2022. Um, and then in 2011, the museum actually became its own separate entity from the construction nonprofit that had, or
Mhm.
community development corporation that had created the space. Started doing a lot more temporary exhibits, started doing a lot more programming. Um, and that kind of ebbed and flowed over the next basically decade, because it was all volunteer, right? Sometimes you have the capacity to do a lot, sometimes you don't. Um, and then, yeah, in 2020, or in 2019, our state rep, Jay Livingstone, was able to secure a small earmark that was used to hire me, and it's really kind of taken off since then, which we're really excited.
What went into the reorganization and the vision for the current museum, the design, the focus?
So I mean, a lot. The so part of this, and an interesting kind of element of the flood too, right, was that we had started looking at redesigning the permanent exhibit and the whole museum in 2020. And actually, one of the grants that ended up paying for this reconstruction was submitted, I believe, literally the day before the flood.
Wow.
So that ended up being a huge help, $200,000 from Mass Cultural Council, but that was submitted with a completely different plan,
Mm.
right? And um, so once the flood happened, right, all of a sudden you're kind of looking at this space that's just like empty, and it's, so we were sort of like, well, I guess that means we can, you know, do anything with it. Um, and we knew already, because we've been thinking about it, that one of the big things that we needed to do was transition from being primarily a place of memory to primarily a place of learning, right?
Mm.
When the museum was founded, there were still about 5,000 displaced West Enders living. When we started planning this stuff, there were probably 500. Today, it may be a little more than that, but today it's probably 3 to 500.
Mm.
Um, so that's not, they're not the primary group that we're going to be serving anymore, right?
Right.
Um, of course, we still really value their input and still really value the people, their descendants being involved, but less and less displaced West Enders are directly involved in the museum. And um, so we started from that point and then said, basically, well, when you kind of leave the museum, what are like one or two things that we want you to know, right? Or to feel or whatever. Because we know you're not, I mean, we hope you remember everything, but we know you're not going to. So we kind of settled on these very broad themes, which were that you should come across say feeling that or understanding how people in communities matter, how place matters, and then the value of Boston in that
Mm.
context, um, and then kind of um, from that, and especially because we updated our mission, which was like a 3 paragraph statement before, um, to really focus on making people appreciate that being involved and understanding, right, going to community meetings and that kind of thing,
Mm.
is really important to having a voice in your community. And if you don't do that, right, you're letting these kinds of changes. I mean, hopefully not on this scale, but those kinds of changes happen without your input. So we started with that, and then we started kind of looking and talking to people and seeing what we could do. The original kind of concept had a 3D map of the museum as its central element, that it actually isn't installed yet because that'll be phase 2,
Mm.
another another big investment. But the ultimate design will have a map like that, but it'll be a digital
Oh,
thing.
nice,
And
nice.
and we were playing around with this and we were looking, and you can do a lot of amazing things with 3D maps now, but like what you can do, like a say $2 million 3D map can do the same thing as like a $300,000 digital map, right?
Mm.
So it's again, right, we haven't installed this yet because it's still a huge investment that I need
Sure,
to fundraise
sure.
for. But the so we really were evaluating across a lot of things like this, right? Like, is this the way to do this? Is there an alternative? If there's an alternative, is it, better or worse? And started to kind of form this like what broadly should this look like? Um,
Mhm.
which was it ended up being a series of what we called modules, that originally were all exactly the same layout and are now not. That were like, okay, like you have one that's early history, you have one that's like immigrant neighborhood, you have one
Mm.
that whatever. And then at about that point in the process, we'd been working with our architectural team, who was awesome and did everything pro bono. Jen Asher,
Wow.
architecture, yeah. Um,
Mm.
so they kind of had that layout. And around that point, we identified the design company that we wanted to work with. So um, maybe a little atypically, but we really, really wanted to hold like very strong like intellectual and design control over the space, more than is typical. So like we did all the writing and stuff in-house
Hmm.
and research. Um, but we needed someone to do the digital elements with us and help kind of lay those out and make them fit within the broader context, and that firm, Trivium Interactive, which is based just nearby in the North End. um, they really they helped us kind of develop this like emotional journey of
Hmm.
like what it was gonna kind of what the like kind of experience of walking through the exhibit would mean. And I think once we had that and we started to kind of prioritize and say, hey, 10% of this, we feel comfortable dedicating 10% of our walls, to this topic, or we feel comfortable dedicating 40% to this topic, and looking at like, well, how much of it was dedicated to this in the old exhibit and how much, right? Um, and so we started to settle on like what space was going to be occupied by what topics. And then I mean obviously started really developing the content. Because interestingly, I because this is sort of backwards to how I think about the exhibit, and is in my head I think how we were thinking about it the whole time, but the digital stuff all had to happen first,
Hmm.
right? So like
Sure.
you have like the way you're thinking through the exhibit is like blah 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 text plus some pictures, and then this screen that does this thing, this screen that does this thing, display case with something in it, you know, text, and then like this. So you start knowing, or we started knowing really just what the digital elements were going to be in detail. And then once we had those, we kind of did some kind of strategic decisions, but decided we wanted people to be able to get the basic, like fundamental story, and get a basic understanding no matter how they interacted with the space. So you should be able to read everything and understand. You should be able to just use this digital materials and understand. You should be able to do a mix of both. And so once we'd settled on that, it became pretty simple to put together the text on the walls. That it's an amazingly small amount of writing
Hmm.
that actually fits on a wall. I think it's like 3 pages total.
Hmm.
So we pulled that together, and our graphic designer, who's a board member and actually started as a volunteer, is the descendant of a displaced West Ender,
Ah.
and was volunteering with us. She and I really rebranded the museum, and built a new website that actually launched like again like maybe 2 weeks before the
Hmm.
flood.
Wow. Hmm.
And then and then um, had joined the board. Was So she everything that you're seeing here that isn't digital, she designed with us, did all the layouts and everything. Um, and
What's been some of the reaction and feedback to this exhibit entitled Rise, Fall, Rebirth Stories of the West End?
yeah, so the reception has been really, really positive. Overall, I think there are. I mean, the the primary complaint that we've heard is, well, like my picture used to be in the exhibit and now it's not, or like my dad used to be in the exhibit and now he's not. Um, but we did try to keep a lot of like personal, like individuals, images in, but they're not all the same ones, right? So, um, but
Well,
yeah, otherwise it's been really, really positive, which is great. And we're catching a handful of typos and stuff that'll have to get fixed, but
mhm.
but for the
Well, I
most
know
part,
there's
that's coming
very
from us.
rich archives that people can maybe find some of those images or lots of other background information for sure. How about events and programs? I know in the limited time you've had a lot going on already.
Yeah, so we were actually running programs like the whole time we were closed. I think I didn't run much in 2020, both because of COVID and because I was still figuring things out. But we've tried to do at least one program a month since then. Now we're doing 4 or 5.
Mm.
So, and thanks to our my education manager, Grace, for that. Um, but yeah, so we do all kinds of things. We try to do about once a month, Boston trivia at a local bar. That's back to its normal spot at Causeway, which is just across the street from us. Um, During the playoffs, they couldn't schedule anything, so we had to use some other spots. We have a couple of walking tours. Again, try to do about a walking tour every month. Um, again, there are gaps, but generally. So this month, we had a number of people who were just requesting the kind of general history tour that I used to give twice a month. So we're doing that in a abridged 1.5 hour and a full 3 hour version. And then we have some kind of new, different kind of stuff like drink and draw, film
Mm.
screening. And we just last week had jazz from the Prohibition era with drinks that would have been served at that time, which was a really fun event.
Fabulous, fabulous. How can viewers and other learn more history background, stay informed about current and upcoming plans?
Um, well, the easiest way to keep kind of informed about what the museum's doing is through our newsletter for sure. Almost everything that we post there kind of is at some point available on like social media and stuff. But if you really want to know what's going on, the newsletters, and if you really want to know what's going on, being a member are really the best ways to do that. The weekly, which we launched as our
Mm.
primary form of programming during COVID, and is still going, is still one of the changes that I'm most proud of here, along with the new exhibit. Is a history article that we publish every week,
Mhm.
um, plus the programs and stuff that are coming up. Um, but those are really cool. We've done about I think more than 200 articles now, which is just
Wow.
crazy.
Yeah, no, it really is. And the website itself is very rich with a lot of historical information
Yeah,
and
so all those articles are kind of preserved on the website, so you can, on the history page, which I'm pulling up here for my own thought process, but those are all available, and you can sort through them both by time period and by topic. Um,
terrific. Well, Sebastian, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time. I want to thank you so much for taking the time to be here.
Absolutely.
Congratulations again to you and your colleagues for the redesign, reopening of the West End Museum. Definitely a must-see attraction in downtown Boston, and encourage viewers and others to make their way and to enjoy all the hard work that's been done, and look forward to upcoming developments. Continued success.
Thank you so much.
Also want to thank those of you watching for joining us, and hope you'll be able to tune in next time.